8 years of chasing a man who never loved me back taught me one thing: love is not enough. The scent of rain clung to the air as Eleanor stood on the crumbling steps of Blackthorn Manor, her childhood home now cloaked in ivy and shadow. The estate had always been a place of secrets, whispers carried by the wind through its labyrinthine halls, echoes of laughter long silenced by time. Tonight, however, it felt different. Heavier. As if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to disturb its fragile equilibrium. Eleanor tightened her grip on the leather-bound journal she'd found that morning at an antique shop downtown. Its pages hinted at a family scandal buried deep within Blackthorn's history, one tied inexplicably to her own life. She hadn't planned to return here after so many years abroad, but fate, or perhaps desperation, had brought her back. Her fiancé, Adrian, had finally made his indifference clear, leaving her reeling. And then there was Marcus, the charming yet infuriating man who pursued her relentlessly despite her protests. A man whose intentions remained as murky as the mist swirling around her feet. As lightning split the sky, illuminating the cracked windows of the manor, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. Love, betrayal, and redemption awaited her inside, but which path would she choose? Chapter 1, The Return to Blackthorn. The gravel crunched beneath Eleanor's boots as she stepped out of the taxi, her breath catching at the sight of Blackthorn Manor looming before her. The house seemed to breathe, its ivy-covered walls undulating faintly in the wind like ribs expanding and contracting. She hadn't set foot here since her mother's funeral 8 years ago, but the memories came rushing back, the laughter echoing through the halls during summer evenings, the way the chandelier in the dining room would cast rainbows across the floor when sunlight hit it just right. And then there was the darker side, the fights behind closed doors, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. Tonight, though, Blackthorn felt different. Oppressive. As if it were daring her to come closer, to uncover what lay hidden beneath its decaying facade. She hoisted her suitcase onto the porch, the wood groaning underfoot. Her fingers trembled slightly as she fished the rusted key from her coat pocket. It took 3 tries to turn the lock, and when the door finally creaked open, the smell of dampness and mildew enveloped her. She wrinkled her nose but pressed on, flipping the light switch only to find it dead. Of course. Nothing worked properly anymore. Eleanor pulled a flashlight from her bag, its beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes floated lazily in the air as she moved deeper into the house, her footsteps muffled by threadbare rugs. Every corner whispered secrets, secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Adrian's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, she considered ignoring it. But curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of her. "What do you want?" she answered curtly. "I heard you're back," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Thought I'd check in." "Why?" "So you can gloat about how much happier you are without me." He sighed, feigning exasperation. "That's not fair, Ellie. You know I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you?" she snapped, regretting the vulnerability creeping into her tone. Before he could respond, a loud thud echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Eleanor froze, her pulse quickening. "I have to go," she muttered, hanging up before Adrian could protest. Heart pounding, she aimed the flashlight toward the staircase. Shadows danced along the banister, taunting her. Someone, or something, was up there. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Just the steady drip of water somewhere in the distance and the faint creak of floorboards above. Eleanor tightened her grip on the flashlight, steeling herself. Whatever awaited her upstairs, she knew one thing for certain: Blackthorn Manor had no intention of letting her leave unscathed. Chapter 2, A Stranger in the Shadows. Eleanor's footsteps echoed hollowly as she ascended the staircase, each creak of the warped wood amplifying her unease. The flashlight beam wavered in her trembling hand, casting jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. She told herself it was nothing, just an old house settling, but deep down, she knew better. Blackthorn had always been a place where reality blurred with imagination. At the top of the stairs, she paused, listening intently. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only silence heavy enough to press against her chest. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she turned the corner into the dimly lit hallway. Most of the doors were closed, their tarnished handles glinting faintly in the flashlight's glow. But one door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently as if someone had just passed through. She hesitated, then pushed it open further. The room beyond was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. A dusty four-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy sagging under years of neglect. An antique vanity sat against the far wall, its mirror cracked and clouded with age. Yet something felt off. The air was colder here, prickling her skin despite the oppressive heat of the day. And then she saw him. A figure stood silhouetted in the window, his back to her. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might be part of the scenery, a trick of the light or her overactive mind. But when she took a cautious step forward, the floorboard groaned beneath her weight, and he turned. Her breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead. His eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto hers, sending a shiver down her spine. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The man raised an eyebrow, unbothered by her hostility. "I could ask you the same question," he replied, his voice low and smooth, with a hint of mockery. "This isn't exactly a tourist attraction." "This is my family's home," she shot back, straightening her posture. "Who are you?" He smirked, leaning casually against the windowsill. "Just someone who knows more about this place than you do." His cryptic response irritated her, but before she could press further, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Up close, she noticed the faint scar running along his jawline and the way his gaze flickered to the leather-bound journal tucked under her arm. "That book," he said, nodding toward it. "Where did you find it?" Eleanor instinctively pulled the journal closer to her chest. "Why does it matter to you?" His lips curved into a sly smile. "Let's just say I'm curious about what secrets it holds. Your ancestors weren't exactly known for keeping quiet." The implication hung in the air, unsettling her. Before she could respond, another sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, a soft, melodic hum, almost too faint to hear. It wasn't coming from downstairs, it was above them. The man stiffened, his playful demeanor vanishing instantly. "You should leave," he said abruptly, his tone serious now. "This place isn't safe." "Safe for whom?" she challenged, though her resolve faltered as the humming grew louder, weaving through the shadows like a ghostly thread. Without another word, the man brushed past her, disappearing into the hallway. Eleanor stared after him, torn between following and retreating. Whatever game he was playing, she realized with growing certainty, he wasn't telling her everything, and neither was Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 3, The Journal's First Secret. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, torn between chasing after the mysterious man and staying put. But curiosity won out, curiosity not just about him, but about the journal clutched tightly against her chest. If it held answers, she needed to know them now more than ever. She retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind her as if to shut out the creeping unease that had taken root in the hallway. The room felt marginally safer, though the cracked mirror still seemed to watch her with silent judgment. She sat on the edge of the sagging bed, placing the flashlight beside her so its beam illuminated the worn leather cover of the journal. Her fingers traced the embossed initials etched into the corner, CB. They didn't match any names she recognized from her family tree, yet something about them tugged at her memory. Taking a deep breath, she opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, looping across the yellowed paper like whispers from another time. To those who dare read these words, know this: love is both salvation and ruin. Blackthorn carries its weight, and so shall we all. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't exactly the cryptic opening she'd expected, but it set the tone for what followed, a series of fragmented entries detailing a forbidden romance. The writer spoke of stolen moments in hidden alcoves, secret letters exchanged under moonlight, and a love so fierce it defied societal expectations. Yet there were darker undertones too, warnings of betrayal, accusations of treachery, and hints of violence lurking beneath the surface. One passage caught her eye. He says he loves me, but his promises are hollow. I see the way he looks at her, the other woman. Does he think I don't notice? Or does he simply not care? Eleanor frowned, flipping ahead to find more context. The name Margaret appeared repeatedly, alongside references to someone named Thomas. From what she could gather, Margaret was the writer, a distant relative, perhaps, and Thomas was the object of her affection. But their story wasn't one of happily ever afters, it was riddled with suspicion and heartbreak. As she turned another brittle page, a folded slip of paper fluttered onto her lap. Unfolding it carefully, she found a faded sketch of two figures standing beneath an oak tree. One bore a striking resemblance to the man she'd just encountered upstairs. Her stomach churned. Was this some kind of cruel coincidence, or was he connected to her family in ways she couldn't yet fathom? The humming returned then, louder this time, pulling her attention away from the journal. It drifted through the walls like a spectral lullaby, beckoning her toward the attic. Against her better judgment, Eleanor rose, grabbing the flashlight. Whatever secrets Blackthorn held, they weren't going to reveal themselves. Chapter 4, Marcus makes his move. The attic stairs groaned under Eleanor's weight as she ascended, the flashlight beam slicing through the suffocating darkness. The humming grew louder with each step, weaving itself into the fabric of the house like a ghostly thread. By the time she reached the top, her heart was pounding, not just from exertion, but from the eerie sense that she wasn't alone. The attic was vast and cluttered, filled with relics of Blackthorn's past, trunks spilling over with moth-eaten linens, antique furniture draped in dusty sheets, and stacks of brittle books teetering precariously on warped shelves. In the center of the room stood an old gramophone, its brass horn gleaming faintly in the dim light. The source of the humming. Eleanor approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust coating the floorboards. As she drew closer, the melody shifted, no longer a hum, but a haunting tune that seemed to echo directly in her mind. She reached out to touch the gramophone, but before her fingers could graze it, a voice startled her. "You really shouldn't be up here." She whirled around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Marcus leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed and a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked entirely too pleased with himself for someone who just snuck up on her. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "How did you even get in?" He ignored her questions, stepping further into the attic. "That thing," he said, nodding toward the gramophone, "hasn't worked in decades. Yet here it is, spinning away like nothing's wrong." His tone was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge to it, a tension she couldn't quite place. "It started when I came upstairs," she admitted reluctantly, watching him closely. "Do you know why?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he circled the gramophone, inspecting it with feigned nonchalance. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened, losing some of its usual arrogance. "Blackthorn has a way of remembering things. Things people would rather forget." "Like what?" she pressed, irritation bubbling beneath her skin. Stop being cryptic and tell me what you're hiding. His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and unyielding. For a moment, the playful mask slipped, revealing something raw and calculating underneath. I'm not hiding anything, he said evenly. But if I were you, I'd stop digging where I don't belong. Some secrets aren't meant to see the light of day. The warning sent a shiver down her spine, though she refused to let him see it. Why do you care so much about my family's secrets? She shot back. What's your connection to all this? His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting second, she thought he might actually tell her the truth. But then the smirk returned, infuriatingly smug. Let's just say I have a vested interest in keeping certain histories buried. And trust me, Eleanor, you don't want to dig them up. Before she could respond, he turned on his heel and disappeared down the stairs, leaving her alone with the humming gramophone and the unsettling feeling that she'd stumbled onto something far bigger, and far more dangerous, than she'd realized. Chapter 5, Adrian's Last Words. The attic felt colder after Marcus left, the air thick with an unshakable heaviness. The gramophone continued its haunting melody, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to touch it again. Instead, she sank onto a nearby trunk, her mind racing. What did Marcus mean by vested interest? And why did he seem so determined to keep her from uncovering Blackthorn's secrets? Every answer only seemed to spawn more questions. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her out of her thoughts. Adrian's name flashed across the screen once more. She hesitated before answering, unsure if she was ready to face him, or herself, after their last conversation. But something compelled her to swipe the call open. Ellie, Adrian began without preamble, his voice softer than usual. I've been thinking about what you said earlier. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Adrian, I don't have the energy for this right now. No, listen to me, he insisted, his tone firmer now. You're right, I hurt you. I let you down in ways I can never take back. But I need you to understand why. Eleanor clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Why? Because you didn't love me enough? Because chasing your career meant more than us? It wasn't just that, he said quietly, and for the first time, there was no deflection, no smooth excuses. Just raw honesty. It was fear, Ellie. Fear of ruining everything we had by admitting I wasn't ready for forever. His words caught her off guard, stirring emotions she'd buried deep inside. So instead, you strung me along for years while I poured my heart into something you weren't even sure you wanted? I know I messed up, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. But I'm here now, trying to make things right. Can we at least talk about it? Face to face? Eleanor stared at the phone, torn between resentment and longing. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to tell him it was too late, that she deserved better. But another part, the part that still carried fragments of the girl who loved him, ached to believe him, to hope that maybe they could fix what had broken between them. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But don't expect me to forgive you easily. There was a long pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, his tone was heavy with regret. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. Just, be careful, okay? Something about this place, it feels wrong. Like it's watching you. His warning sent a chill through her, echoing Marcus's earlier words. What do you mean? She asked sharply. I don't know, he admitted. Call it instinct. But promise me you'll watch your back. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone, staring at it as if it might hold answers. Between Adrian's cryptic warning and Marcus's veiled threats, she couldn't shake the feeling that Blackthorn Manor was pulling strings she couldn't see. As she descended the attic stairs, the gramophone's melody faded into silence behind her. Yet the weight of its song lingered, humming faintly in the recesses of her mind, a reminder that some tunes are best left unheard. Chapter 6, The Portrait in the Hallway. Eleanor's footsteps echoed softly as she made her way back downstairs, the weight of Adrian's warning settling uncomfortably in her chest. The house seemed quieter now, though that did little to ease her unease. Every shadow felt heavier, every creak more deliberate, as if Blackthorn Manor itself were alive and watching her every move. She paused in the hallway, drawn by a faint glimmer of light spilling from one of the side rooms. It was the study, a room she hadn't entered since childhood, and curiosity tugged at her despite her growing apprehension. Pushing the door open wider, she stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and polished wood enveloping her. The room was frozen in time, untouched by the years. A grand mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with yellowed documents and tarnished inkwells. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents sagging under the weight of forgotten knowledge. But what caught her eye was the portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was a painting of a man, his features strikingly familiar. Dark hair, piercing eyes, an angular jawline marred by a faint scar, it was unmistakably the same face she'd seen earlier in the attic sketch. And yet, there was something else about him, something unsettlingly modern. He looked alive. Her breath hitched as she approached, her pulse quickening. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plaque bore an inscription, Thomas Blackthorn, 1872–1901. Her stomach churned. Thomas, the name from the journal. Margaret's lover. But it wasn't just the resemblance that unnerved her. As she studied the painting, she noticed subtle details that defied logic. The brushstrokes around his eyes seemed almost too vivid, too lifelike, as if they shifted when viewed from different angles. His expression hovered between warmth and menace, leaving her unsure whether he was smiling or sneering. Recognize him? Eleanor jumped, spinning around to find Marcus leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. His presence here, again, was infuriating, but she refused to let him see her rattled. You, she said sharply. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to see you staring at my great-great-grandfather, he replied, his tone deceptively casual. Her brow furrowed. You're, what? Marcus pushed off the doorframe and strode into the room, stopping beside her to gaze up at the portrait. Thomas Blackthorn. Ring any bells? You've been reading about him, haven't you? He glanced at the journal tucked under her arm, his smirk widening. Didn't think I'd miss that, did you? Eleanor's mind raced. You're related to him. To this family? Distantly, he admitted, though his tone suggested otherwise. But blood ties run deep in places like this. Deeper than you might realize. She turned back to the portrait, her thoughts spiraling. If Marcus was connected to Thomas, then his interest in Blackthorn, and in her, was far from coincidental. But why go to such lengths to keep her from uncovering the truth? What happened to him? She asked, gesturing toward the painting. Why does everyone act like he's some kind of ghost haunting this place? Marcus hesitated, his usual bravado faltering for the briefest moment. When he spoke, his voice carried an uncharacteristic gravity. Let's just say Thomas didn't leave this world on good terms. Some say he cursed the family before he died. Others claim he never really left at all. The words sent a shiver down her spine, but Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. And which do you believe? His lips curved into a sly smile, though it lacked its usual mockery. I believe, he said slowly, that Blackthorn Manor doesn't give up its secrets easily. And neither do I. Before she could press further, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the portrait, and the creeping suspicion that she was being played like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. Chapter 7, Whispers in the Dark. The portrait of Thomas Blackthorn lingered in Eleanor's mind long after Marcus left, its unsettling gaze seeming to follow her even as she wandered through the labyrinthine halls of the manor. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, not just metaphorically, but literally. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting ever so slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. It was maddening. By the time night fell, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, she found herself pacing the downstairs corridors, clutching the journal like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. The storm outside had worsened, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling ominously in the distance. Lightning illuminated the rooms in brief, stark flashes, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. It was during one such flash that she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, soft and melodic, drifting from somewhere below. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. The basement. Of course. Every old house had one, and Blackthorn Manor was infamous, sealed off for decades, rumored to hold secrets too dark to face. Her rational side screamed at her to ignore it, to retreat upstairs and lock herself in her room until morning. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pulled her toward the narrow staircase leading down. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of damp earth and mildew thickening until it was almost suffocating. At the bottom, she hesitated, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. The space was vast and cluttered, filled with forgotten furniture, rusted tools, and stacks of rotting crates. In the far corner, however, she spotted a faint glow emanating from beneath a heavy wooden door. The whispers grew louder as she approached, weaving together into words she couldn't quite understand. Her fingers brushed the cold metal handle, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But then she pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber. Inside, two figures stood huddled close, their voices low and urgent. One was unmistakably Marcus, his profile illuminated by the flickering light of a single bulb hanging overhead. The other, she didn't recognize immediately. He was older, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glinted with desperation. "You shouldn't have come here," Marcus hissed, his tone sharp and panicked. "If she finds out." "She already knows," the stranger interrupted, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "You can't protect her forever." Eleanor stepped further into the room, the floor creaking loudly beneath her weight. Both men turned sharply, their expressions mirroring equal parts shock and guilt. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Who is he? And why are you meeting in my basement?" Marcus recovered first, stepping between her and the stranger. "Eleanor, you shouldn't be here," he said, his tone pleading. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then explain it to me," she shot back, clutching the journal tighter. "Because right now, it looks like you're hiding something big. Something dangerous." The stranger chuckled darkly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Dangerous doesn't begin to cover it, Miss Blackthorn. Your family has been running from the truth for generations. It's only a matter of time before it catches up." Before she could respond, Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. "We're leaving. Now." She resisted, twisting free. "No. Not until someone tells me what's really going on." But Marcus wasn't listening. With a muttered curse, he shoved the stranger back into the chamber and slammed the door shut, locking it with a key he pulled from his pocket. Then he turned to her, his expression grim. "I warned you not to dig too deep," he said quietly. "Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered. Trust me, you don't want to know." As they ascended the stairs, the whispers resumed, faint but insistent, echoing in her ears like a promise unfulfilled. Chapter 8, A Friend's Warning. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a throbbing headache and the lingering echo of those basement whispers still haunting her thoughts. Marcus had refused to say another word after dragging her out of the cellar, leaving her alone in the kitchen while he disappeared into the rain-soaked night. She hadn't seen him since, and part of her was relieved. His presence only seemed to complicate things further, weaving an intricate web of secrets she wasn't sure she wanted, or needed, to untangle. Determined to clear her head, Eleanor decided to visit Lila, her oldest and most trusted friend. Lila lived just outside town, in a cozy cottage surrounded by wildflowers that always seemed to bloom no matter the season. If anyone could help her make sense of the chaos swirling around her, it was Lila. When Eleanor arrived, Lila greeted her with a warm hug and a knowing look. "You look like you've been wrestling ghosts," she said, ushering Eleanor inside. The cottage smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread, a comforting contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of Blackthorn Manor. "I might as well have been," Eleanor muttered, sinking onto the couch. She recounted everything, the mysterious man in the attic, the journal's cryptic entries, Marcus's strange behavior, and last night's unsettling encounter in the basement. By the time she finished, Lila's expression had shifted from concern to something darker. "You need to be careful, Ellie," Lila said firmly, perching on the edge of her armchair. "Marcus isn't who he says he is." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Lila hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "I didn't want to tell you this because I knew it would upset you, but Marcus has a reputation. People talk about him in town. They say he's involved in shady deals, property scams, blackmail, maybe worse. No one knows for sure, but everyone agrees he's dangerous." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. But why would he care about Blackthorn Manor? Why go to all this trouble? "That's what worries me," Lila admitted. "If he's willing to lie and manipulate to get close to you, then whatever he's after must be important. Maybe even valuable." Eleanor's mind raced back to the journal, the portrait of Thomas, and the stranger in the basement. Was Marcus after some hidden treasure? A family heirloom? Or was it something more sinister? "There's something else," Lila added hesitantly. "About your family. I overheard my grandmother talking once. She used to work for the Blackthorns. She mentioned something about a curse tied to the estate. Something about unrequited love and betrayal leading to ruin." "A curse?" Eleanor echoed skeptically. "That sounds like a ghost story." "Maybe," Lila conceded. "But think about it, Ellie. Everything weird that's happened since you got back, it's like the house is alive. And Marcus showing up out of nowhere? It's too coincidental." Eleanor rubbed her temples, overwhelmed. As much as she wanted to dismiss Lila's warnings as paranoia, they struck a chord deep within her. Blackthorn Manor had always been a place of mystery, but now it felt like the mysteries were closing in, tightening their grip until she couldn't breathe. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Eleanor confessed quietly. "But I can't just walk away. Not when I feel like I'm so close to finding answers." Lila reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Just promise me you'll watch your back. Whatever's going on, it's bigger than you realize." "And Marcus," she trailed off, shaking her head. "He's not the ally you think he is." As Eleanor left the cottage later that afternoon, Lila's words replayed in her mind like a warning bell. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road back to Blackthorn Manor. For the first time, she noticed how the trees lining the path seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. And somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of the gramophone began again. Chapter 9, Betrayal Unveiled. The gramophone's melody followed Eleanor like a ghost as she approached Blackthorn Manor, its notes weaving through the twilight air with an eerie familiarity. By the time she reached the front door, her nerves were taut, every shadow seeming to shift and stretch unnaturally. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and uninviting, yet she couldn't bring herself to turn away. Inside, the oppressive stillness was almost suffocating. She called out tentatively, half expecting Marcus to appear from the shadows, but there was no response, only the faint creak of settling wood and the distant drip of water echoing through the halls. Determined to confront him, she headed toward the study, where she'd last seen him lingering near Thomas's portrait. But when she entered the room, it wasn't Marcus waiting for her. Instead, she found Adrian standing by the fireplace, his hands shoved deep into his pockets and his expression unreadable. "Adrian?" she said, startled. "What are you doing here?" He turned to face her, his eyes clouded with unease. "I came to warn you," he said quietly. "About Marcus." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What about him?" Adrian hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "He's been using you, Ellie. He didn't come to Blackthorn because of some family connection or misplaced loyalty. He's after something valuable, and he thinks you're the key to getting it." Her heart sank. "You mean the journal? Or the portrait?" "I don't know exactly what it is," Adrian admitted. "But I overheard him talking to someone in town, a man who mentioned your family name and hinted at unfinished business. Whatever it is, it's worth enough to make Marcus lie, manipulate, and maybe even hurt people to get it." Eleanor sank onto the edge of the desk, her mind reeling. Everything Lila had warned her about came rushing back, along with Marcus's cryptic comments and evasive behavior. Could Adrian be right? Was Marcus playing her for a fool? Before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house, startling them both. They exchanged wary glances before heading to the foyer. When Eleanor opened the door, she found Marcus standing on the threshold, drenched from the rain and looking unusually disheveled. "Eleanor," he began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." She crossed her arms, her resolve hardening. "Talk about what, Marcus?" "About how you've been lying to me since the moment we met. About how you're using me to get whatever it is you think my family has hidden here." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped inside, brushing past Adrian without acknowledgement. "It's not that simple," he said, turning to face her. "Yes, I came here for a reason, but not for myself. I'm trying to protect someone close to you. Someone who's in danger because of what's buried in this house." Eleanor stared at him, incredulous. "Protect who? From what?" Marcus glanced at Adrian, then back at her, his expression conflicted. "Your mother," he said finally. "Before she died, she entrusted me with something, a secret she believed would keep you safe. But now, others know about it, and they'll stop at nothing to find it." The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mother. What could she possibly have hidden that would put Eleanor in danger years after her death? Adrian stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Don't listen to him, Ellie. He's manipulating you again." "No," Marcus snapped, rounding on Adrian. "You don't understand what's at stake. If Eleanor doesn't cooperate, they'll destroy everything, and everyone, she cares about." Eleanor felt the walls closing in, torn between trusting Marcus's desperate plea and believing Adrian's warning. Before she could decide, a loud crash erupted from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. All three froze, their gazes snapping upward. The gramophone's hum grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards like a heartbeat. "Stay here," Marcus ordered, already moving toward the staircase. But Eleanor ignored him, following close behind. Whatever was happening in Blackthorn Manor, she was done being kept in the dark. Chapter 10, The Family Curse. The crash had come from the attic, and as Eleanor climbed the creaking stairs with Marcus close behind, the gramophone's hum grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it felt like a pulse, throbbing in sync with her racing heart. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering light of an old lantern Marcus had grabbed on his way up. The air was thick with dust and something else, something metallic, almost electric. When they reached the attic door, it was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if nudged by an unseen hand. Inside, chaos reigned. The gramophone spun wildly, its needles skipping across the record in erratic bursts. Papers were strewn everywhere, torn from trunks and scattered like confetti. Someone, or something, had been searching for something. Eleanor stepped cautiously into the room, her eyes scanning the destruction. "What happened here?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. Marcus moved past her, his movements tense and deliberate. He knelt beside one of the overturned trunks, sifting through its contents. "They found us," he muttered under his breath. "I thought we had more time." "Who found us?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising. "And why are they tearing apart my house?" Before Marcus could respond, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "Ellie, get out of here," he said urgently. "This isn't safe." Eleanor turned to him, frustration bubbling over. "Neither of you will tell me anything. How am I supposed to trust either of you when all you do is lie?" Adrian hesitated, glancing at Marcus before stepping fully into the room. "Fine," he said, his tone firm. "If you won't tell you, I will. Your family's curse, it's real. And it's tied to whatever your mother hid in this house." Eleanor stared at him, disbelief warring with dread. "A curse? You're serious?" Adrian nodded grimly. "It started with Thomas Blackthorn, the man in the portrait. His affair with Margaret ended in betrayal and violence. Some say he cursed the family before he died, vowing that anyone who loved unrequitedly would suffer the same fate. Others claim it's not a curse but a pattern, a cycle of obsession and ruin passed down through generations." Marcus stood abruptly, his expression darkening. "Enough," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I don't." Adrian shot back, his voice sharp. "Then explain why everyone connected to this family ends up hurt, or worse. Why your great-great-grandfather looks exactly like you. Why you're so desperate to find whatever secret your mother left behind." Eleanor's head spun as the pieces began to fall into place. The journal, the portrait, the whispers in the dark, they weren't random. They were threads in a tapestry of tragedy stretching back decades. "What did my mother hide?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, ornate locket. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, engraved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "This," he said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died. Said it contained the key to breaking the cycle. But now," he trailed off, his gaze flickering toward the shattered window. Eleanor took the locket from him, her fingers trembling. As she opened it, a tiny scrap of paper fell into her palm. On it was written a single phrase. "Love freely, or lose everything." Before she could process its meaning, a deafening crack split the air. The ceiling above them groaned ominously, and plaster rained down as the floor beneath their feet began to buckle. "Move!" Marcus shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her toward the stairs. But as they fled the collapsing attic, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the curse wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 11, Adrian Returns. The descent from the collapsing attic was a blur of panic and chaos. Eleanor's lungs burned as she stumbled down the narrow staircase, Marcus's grip on her arm like an iron clamp. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood and crumbling plaster echoed through the house, as if Blackthorn Manor itself were falling apart in protest. When they finally reached the second-floor landing, Adrian was waiting, his face pale but resolute. "This way," he said sharply, leading them toward the back staircase that spiraled down to the kitchen. The air smelled acrid now, tinged with smoke, and distant flames flickered somewhere deeper in the house. "Fire?" Eleanor gasped, her voice hoarse. How is there a fire? No time for questions, Marcus growled, pushing past Adrian to take the lead. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by something far more primal, fear. They reached the ground floor just as the first wave of heat hit them, searing and suffocating. The kitchen door stood ajar, offering a sliver of cool night air beyond. But before they could escape, a figure emerged from the shadows near the pantry, a man with hollow eyes and a gaunt frame, the same stranger Eleanor had seen arguing with Marcus in the basement. You shouldn't have come back, the man rasped, his gaze locking onto Eleanor. In his hand, he held a lit match, its flame dancing precariously close to a trail of spilled oil snaking across the floor. Don't do this, Marcus warned, stepping protectively in front of Eleanor. His voice was low, dangerous. You don't want to make things worse. The stranger laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Worse? You think it can get any worse than what your family has already done? The Blackthorns ruined mine. Now it's their turn to burn. Before anyone could react, he dropped the match. Flames erupted instantly, racing along the oil slick and engulfing the room in seconds. Heat roared around them, forcing them to retreat toward the front door. Smoke filled the hallway, choking and blinding. Go! Adrian shouted, shoving Eleanor ahead of him. She stumbled forward, clutching the locket tightly in her fist. The world outside felt impossibly distant, the fresh air a mirage she wasn't sure they'd reach in time. But then Marcus grabbed her other arm, pulling her toward the foyer. Together, the three of them burst through the front door, tumbling onto the wet grass as the house groaned behind them. Firelight illuminated the windows, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters across the lawn. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, coughing violently as she gulped in lungfuls of cold night air. Her body trembled, not just from the shock of narrowly escaping death, but from the weight of everything that had been revealed. The curse, the secrets, the betrayals, it all swirled inside her like a storm she couldn't contain. And yet, amidst the chaos, one thought rose above the rest: why did Adrian come back? As if sensing her unspoken question, Adrian knelt beside her, his expression softening. I know I hurt you, he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. I walked away when I should have stayed. But I'm here now, Ellie. Let me help you fix this. His words struck a chord deep within her, stirring emotions she'd buried long ago. For years, she'd convinced herself that Adrian didn't care, that his rejection proved he never truly loved her. But seeing him now, risking his life to save hers, made her wonder if she'd been wrong. Marcus watched silently from a few feet away, his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides. There was no trace of the charming, enigmatic man who'd first appeared in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor. Instead, he looked defeated. As though whatever battle he'd been fighting had finally caught up to him. I'll explain everything, Marcus said abruptly, his tone clipped. But not here. Not while that madman is still out there. Eleanor glanced back at the burning house, its silhouette outlined against the dark sky. It felt symbolic somehow, as if the fire was consuming not just the physical structure, but the lies and secrets that had plagued her family for generations. For the first time in days, she felt clarity breaking through the fog of confusion. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't face it alone. Chapter 12, The Truth About Marcus. The fire raged behind them, its hungry flames consuming Blackthorn Manor with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. Eleanor sat on the damp grass, her breath still ragged from the escape, as Marcus paced nearby like a caged animal. Adrian lingered close to her, his presence both comforting and complicated. The weight of unanswered questions hung heavy in the air, pressing down on all three of them. Finally, Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face Eleanor, his expression grim but resolute. You deserve the truth, he said, his voice low and steady. All of it. Eleanor straightened, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. Then start talking. Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Your mother, she wasn't just protecting you when she gave me the locket. She was trying to protect herself, and everyone else tied to this family curse. What do you mean? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed. He hesitated, glancing at Adrian before continuing. The curse isn't just about unrequited love or betrayal. It's about power. Thomas Blackthorn didn't die naturally, he was murdered. And the secret he took to his grave? A map leading to something hidden beneath this estate. Something valuable enough to kill for. Eleanor's mind raced. What kind of something? A relic, Marcus admitted reluctantly. An artifact tied to the origins of the curse itself. Your mother believed it could either break the cycle or unleash even greater destruction if it fell into the wrong hands. Adrian stepped forward, his tone skeptical. And you expect us to believe you're the good guy here? After everything you've done? I never claimed to be a saint, Marcus shot back, his temper flaring. But I'm not the one setting fires or threatening innocent people. That man, the one who tried to burn us alive, he works for someone powerful. Someone who wants the relic for themselves. And what about you? Eleanor demanded, rising to her feet. Why are you so desperate to find it? Marcus met her gaze, his eyes filled with something akin to guilt. Because my family has been paying the price for generations. My great-great-grandfather, Thomas. He wasn't just involved with Margaret Blackthorn, he was framed for her murder. The real killer walked free while our family name was dragged through the mud. Finding the relic is the only way to clear our legacy. Eleanor stared at him, torn between disbelief and pity. Everything he'd said sounded plausible, yet there was no denying his actions had been manipulative, even dangerous. Could she trust him now, knowing how far he'd go to achieve his goals? Before she could respond, Adrian interjected, his voice sharp. Even if we believe your sob story, what makes you think you can stop whoever's after the relic? They already burned the house down. What's next? Marcus clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. We don't have a choice. If we don't act fast, they'll find the artifact first, and then no one will be safe. Eleanor glanced between the two men, their conflicting motivations swirling around her like storm clouds. For years, she'd chased love and validation, only to end up heartbroken and disillusioned. Now, faced with a choice between trusting Adrian's sincerity or Marcus's desperation, she realized neither path offered easy answers. But as the fire crackled in the background, reducing Blackthorn Manor to ash, one thing became clear: the past wouldn't let her go until she confronted it head-on. Chapter 13, Choices in the Fog. The fire had died down by dawn, leaving behind a skeletal husk of what was once Blackthorn Manor. Smoke still curled lazily into the gray morning sky, mingling with the thick fog that clung to the grounds like a shroud. Eleanor stood at the edge of the charred remains, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared at the ruins. The locket hung heavy in her pocket, its presence both comforting and ominous. Marcus and Adrian stood a few paces apart, their postures tense but resigned. Neither had spoken much since the night before, each lost in their own thoughts, or perhaps waiting for her to make the next move. She could feel their eyes on her, weighing her silence, anticipating her decision. She turned to Marcus first, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. If what you're saying is true, if this relic can end the curse, then we need to find it before whoever's after it does. Marcus nodded sharply, relief flickering across his features. I know where to start looking. There's an underground chamber beneath the estate. It's hidden, but I think I can get us there. And if you're wrong? Adrian cut in, stepping closer. His tone wasn't accusatory, just cautious. What happens when we walk straight into another trap? I'm not asking either of you to come with me, Eleanor said firmly, meeting his gaze. But I have to do this. For my mother. For my family. For myself. Adrian studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You're impossible, you know that. Even now, you're still running headfirst into danger. Someone has to, she replied softly. If I don't, who will? Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We'll go together. Both of us. You shouldn't face this alone. Eleanor hesitated, torn between gratitude and skepticism. Trusting Marcus felt like walking a tightrope without a safety net, but abandoning him entirely seemed reckless. And Adrian? Adrian's return complicated things further. Was he here out of guilt, or because he truly cared? Either way, she couldn't deny the comfort his presence brought. Fine, she said finally. But we move carefully. No more secrets. No more lies. They agreed, though the tension between them remained palpable. As they prepared to search for the hidden chamber, Eleanor paused to take one last look at the smoldering wreckage of Blackthorn Manor. Memories flashed unbidden through her mind, the laughter, the fights, the whispered promises, and she wondered how much of her life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. The trio set off toward the woods surrounding the estate, following Marcus's lead. He moved with purpose, brushing aside low-hanging branches and scanning the ground for signs of disturbance. After nearly an hour of trekking, they reached a clearing dominated by a massive oak tree. Its gnarled roots twisted outward, forming a natural archway that led to a patch of earth darker than the rest. This is it, Marcus said, crouching to examine the soil. The entrance should be here. Adrian frowned, glancing around warily. How do you even know about this place? My family passed down the knowledge, Marcus admitted, avoiding eye contact. It's why I came back. Why I stayed. Eleanor knelt beside him, brushing away leaves and dirt to reveal a rusted iron ring embedded in the ground. With effort, they managed to pry open the hatch, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. As they descended, the air grew colder, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic, almost electric. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, symbols etched deep into the rock that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light of their flashlights. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavernous chamber dominated by a pedestal at its center. Resting atop it was an object swathed in black cloth. Eleanor approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she reached out to uncover it. Beneath the fabric lay a small, intricately carved box. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though alive with energy. But before she could touch it, a voice echoed through the chamber. You shouldn't have come. They spun around to see the gaunt stranger from the fire standing in the shadows, flanked by two others. Their faces were obscured, but their intentions were clear. You're too late, Marcus growled, stepping protectively in front of Eleanor. The stranger smiled coldly. Are we? Eleanor tightened her grip on the locket, her mind racing. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain, choices made in fear rarely led to freedom. Chapter 14, Redemption and Ruin. The stranger's cold smile sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine, but she refused to let fear dictate her next move. The box on the pedestal pulsed faintly, its energy humming in sync with the locket clutched tightly in her hand. Whatever this artifact was, it clearly held immense power, and everyone in the chamber knew it. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Marcus warned, his voice low and dangerous as he stepped further in front of Eleanor. If you take that box, you'll unleash something none of us can control. The stranger chuckled darkly, his hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Oh, we understand perfectly. That's why we're here. Your family has hoarded its secrets long enough, Marcus. It's time someone else took charge. Adrian moved closer to Eleanor, his body tense and ready for action. "We're not letting you walk out of here with it," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The two figures flanking the stranger shifted, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Eleanor glanced at the locket in her hand, then at the box on the pedestal. Something about the symbols carved into both felt eerily familiar, as if they were pieces of the same puzzle. A memory surfaced unbidden, her mother's voice, soft and urgent, whispering words she hadn't understood as a child. "Love freely, or lose everything." Her breath hitched. Could the locket be the key to unlocking, or sealing, the box? Before she could act, the stranger lunged forward, his movements swift and calculated. Chaos erupted as Marcus tackled him, grappling for control while Adrian fended off one of the henchmen. Eleanor stumbled back, clutching the locket as the second figure advanced on her. "Give it to me," the man growled, reaching for her wrist. Instinct kicked in. She swung the flashlight she'd been holding, striking him squarely across the face. He staggered, giving her just enough time to dart toward the pedestal. Her heart pounded as she placed the locket against the box, aligning its engravings with the symbols etched into the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the box began to glow, its light intensifying until it filled the entire chamber. The strangers froze, shielding their eyes as the hum of energy grew deafening. Marcus shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of power emanating from the artifact. Eleanor felt a surge of warmth flood through her, followed by an overwhelming sense of clarity. Images flashed before her eyes, her ancestors, their loves and betrayals, the choices that had shaped the curse over generations. And then she saw Thomas Blackthorn, his face twisted in anguish as he whispered a single word, "Forgive." The light dimmed abruptly, leaving the chamber bathed in eerie silence. When Eleanor opened her eyes, the box was gone, replaced by a faint imprint of its symbols on the pedestal. The strangers lay unconscious on the ground, their expressions slack with shock. Marcus approached cautiously, his face pale but awestruck. What did you do?" "I think I ended it," Eleanor murmured, her voice trembling. "The curse, it's broken." Adrian reached her side, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in her chest. Breaking the curse didn't erase the pain it had caused, or the choices she still had to make. As they climbed back to the surface, dawn broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the ruins of Blackthorn Manor. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt free, but freedom came with its own questions. Chapter 15, Love Among the Ashes. The morning sun bathed the remnants of Blackthorn Manor in a soft, golden glow, transforming the charred ruins into something almost beautiful. Eleanor stood at the edge of what had once been the grand entrance, her arms crossed tightly against the cool breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and ash. The weight of the locket still hung heavy in her pocket, but its presence no longer felt ominous. It was a reminder of survival, of choices made despite fear. Behind her, Marcus and Adrian lingered silently, their postures mirroring her own uncertainty. Neither man had spoken much since they emerged from the underground chamber, each lost in their thoughts, or perhaps waiting for her to decide what came next. She could feel their eyes on her, weighing her silence, anticipating her choice. Eleanor turned to face them, her heart pounding as she searched both faces. Marcus's expression was guarded, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet vulnerability. Adrian, meanwhile, looked at her with an openness she hadn't seen in years, a raw honesty that reminded her of happier times before bitterness and betrayal had driven them apart. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Both of you risked everything to help me confront this nightmare. And now," she hesitated, glancing back at the ruins. "Now it's over." But is it? Marcus asked quietly, stepping forward. His tone wasn't challenging, just probing. You broke the curse, Eleanor, but some wounds take longer to heal. Some scars never fade. She met his gaze, seeing the pain etched into his features, the burden of generations he'd carried alone until now. Whatever his flaws, whatever his secrets, he had shown her a side of himself she couldn't ignore. He wasn't perfect, but neither was she. And then there's us, Adrian added softly, drawing her attention. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for rejection. I can't undo the past, Ellie. But I want to try, to make things right, if you'll let me. Eleanor's chest tightened. Here they were, two men who represented opposite ends of her emotional spectrum, Marcus, the enigma whose motives had always been questionable yet whose actions spoke of loyalty, and Adrian, the ghost of love lost, offering redemption wrapped in regret. How could she choose between them when neither path promised certainty? But maybe that was the point. Love, real love, wasn't about guarantees or perfection. It was about choosing to move forward despite the unknown, trusting that the connection mattered more than the destination. As dawn stretched into mid-morning, Eleanor realized she didn't have to choose, not yet. Not here, among the ashes of her family's legacy. What she needed now was time, to heal, to understand herself better, and to figure out who she wanted to be without the shadow of Blackthorn looming over her. I need space, she said finally, her voice firm but gentle. To think. To breathe. This place, it's shaped so much of who I am, but I can't keep living in its shadow. She looked between them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Whatever happens next, for all of us, it has to start somewhere else. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as if swallowing disappointment. If that's what you need, then I'll respect it. Just, don't disappear completely, okay? Adrian offered a small, bittersweet smile. Take all the time you need, Ellie. I'll be here when you're ready. With those words hanging in the air, Eleanor walked away from the ruins, leaving behind the ghosts of her past, and the men who might shape her future. As she stepped onto the gravel path leading away from Blackthorn Manor, she felt lighter, freer. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that love wasn't something to chase or cling to desperately. It was something to nurture, patiently and deliberately, even amid the ashes of what once was. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear, her journey had only just begun. Conclusion. In the end, after 8 years chasing my fiancé unreciprocated, I married someone who pursued me, but he was a jerk, is more than just a tale of romance entwined with suspense, it's a meditation on love, identity, and the courage to break free from the chains of the past. Eleanor's journey through Blackthorn Manor mirrors her internal struggle, a battle between fear and freedom, obligation and self-discovery. The destruction of the manor symbolizes not only the end of a physical legacy but also the dismantling of the emotional burdens Eleanor carried for so long. The curse, once an insurmountable force dictating her family's fate, becomes a catalyst for growth. By confronting its origins and choosing forgiveness over vengeance, Eleanor reclaims agency over her life. She learns that love isn't about chasing validation or clinging to what's familiar, it's about embracing vulnerability, trusting oneself, and allowing relationships to evolve naturally. Marcus and Adrian represent two sides of Eleanor's heart, one tied to intrigue and passion, the other rooted in nostalgia and redemption. Neither relationship offers easy answers, reflecting the complexities of real-life choices. In walking away from both men, at least for now, Eleanor demonstrates maturity and wisdom. She understands that healing takes time, and rushing into decisions out of fear or obligation would only perpetuate the cycles she fought so hard to escape. The recurring motifs, the locket, the gramophone's haunting melody, the portrait of Thomas Blackthorn, serve as reminders of how history shapes us but doesn't define us. Eleanor's ultimate act of placing the locket against the artifact underscores the transformative power of forgiveness, both for others and for oneself. It's a poignant reminder that breaking curses often requires confronting uncomfortable truths and making sacrifices no one else can fully understand. As Eleanor walks away from Blackthorn Manor, leaving behind its ashes and secrets, readers are left with a sense of hope tempered by realism. Love isn't a destination, it's a process, messy and unpredictable. And while the future remains uncertain, Eleanor steps into it with newfound clarity and strength. Her decision to carve her own path, untethered from the expectations of her family or the men in her life, reflects the novel's central message: true freedom comes from within. For those who followed Eleanor's journey, the conclusion leaves room for reflection. Will Marcus find peace after generations of carrying his family's burden? Can Adrian rebuild trust after years of regret? And will Eleanor ever open her heart again, or has she learned to cherish solitude as much as connection? These questions linger, unresolved, echoing the bittersweet nature of life itself. Ultimately, this story reminds us that even amidst betrayal, loss, and heartache, there is always the possibility of renewal. Like dawn breaking over the horizon, Eleanor's final steps toward the unknown signal not an ending, but a beginning, a chance to rewrite her story on her own terms.